here. For instance, absolute value of 7 is?
7.
Absolute value negative 7?
7.
Absolute value 0.45?
0.45.
Absolute value negative 0.45?
0.45.
Absolute value 0?
0.
University got it right. So in making those observations, you have in essence said the absolute value of a number will never be
Negative.
negative. Okay, so we made a general observation. We looked at all examples, we looked at some examples, we thought through the concept, and we came to the conclusion, absolute value is not going to be negative. And it's not going to be negative because of the definition of absolute value. Here it is. The absolute value of a number is the distance between that number and 0 on the number line. The absolute value of a number is the distance between that number and 0 on the number line. So if I'm talking about the absolute value of 7, my question basically, based on the definition, is if this is in mile units, how far would I have to walk from 7 back to 0? 7 miles. Right? If we're talking about the absolute value of negative 7, I'm asking the same question. What's the distance from negative 7 to 0? 7 miles. So we're still talking about 7 miles. We're talking about a distance. And since we think of distances in non-negative terms, the absolute value will never be negative. For instance, none of you would say, you know, last weekend we drove 90 miles all the way to Houston, realized we'd forgotten my little brother, so we had to drive negative 90 miles back. You wouldn't say that. You would, your odometer doesn't think like that. I mean, it goes 90 miles and it goes 90 more miles. We think I drove 90 miles to Houston, I drove 90 miles back. The direction is not what comes to mind. What comes to mind is an absolute value, a distance which we consider to be non-negative. And that's the concept. Since distance is never considered to be negative, the absolute value of a number will never be negative. Nobody ever told me that when I was encountering absolute value. They were talking about a distance. Once you get that concept down, that absolute value is a distance, it makes sense why it's not going to be negative. Right, here's a question for you to ponder. Let's see if you can give me an example of it. Can an expression involving absolute value ever have a negative value? For an example. Now here's what I want you to do. If you think that's possible, go ahead and write down an example involving an expression involving absolute value, where when we figure it out at the end, we're going to end up with a negative number. See if you can do that. Go ahead and write down something. With your pen on the paper. Anybody have an example they'd like to share with us? What you guys say?
Absolute value of negative 7 plus negative 10.
Hang on a second. Absolute value of negative 7. Now, did I close the absolute value? What's that?
Plus negative 10.
Plus negative 10. Is that the entirety? Okay, what is this?
7.
Plus a negative 10 is
Negative 3.
negative 3. Okay, there's an expression involving absolute value that ends up with a negative number. Who's got another one? Yes, ma'am, what you got?
Having a negative on the outside
Oh, like what? Negative?
and absolute value is
Okay. Remember, please excuse my dear self. We typically say the P stands for parentheses. But watch this, ladies and gentlemen. Absolute value is an application of the P, and please excuse my dear self. It is a grouping symbol. It says, do what's in here first, then think about anything else. Just as if it were parentheses, just as if it were a bracket. So what is the absolute value of 7?
7.
Take a negative and?
Negative.
Negative 7. Absolutely. Can anybody do one involving 2 absolute value symbols? Did anybody do one involving 2 absolute value symbols? Can anybody do one involving 2 absolute value symbols? Can anybody juggle 3 balls this evening? Can anybody? Oh. Anybody got one? Think it. 2 absolute value symbols. Yes, ma'am.
The absolute value of 2 minus the absolute value of 6.
How about that? That's 2. That's 6. Got a minus sign in between. Very good, Nate. So, general observation. Just because you see absolute values showing up does not mean your final answer is necessarily going to be positive. The absolute value is not going to be negative, but the entirety of the statement may be very negative. Question? Comment? What is did I give you the list before to see if you're on the roll? Okay. If you still hadn't checked that, you're still wondering if you are in the class, make sure you are. Here's the list of my official enrollees. Hey, who's going to the game on